Sergeant Brian Calloway thought he was doing his job, keeping the streets safe. But when he handcuffed a jogger for looking suspicious, he didn't realize he was arresting the one person who could end his career, his boss. What followed wasn't just a mistake, it was a reckoning. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Brookfield, Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything seemed perfect: trimmed hedges, freshly painted mailboxes, and the occasional jogger moving in rhythm to their playlist. Sergeant Brian Calloway cruised through the streets, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lazily on the radio. 20 years on the force had taught him one thing: people weren't always what they seemed. Calloway was a man of routine, a cop who prided himself on his instincts. He had a reputation for being tough, direct, and unyielding. To him, justice wasn't just a concept, it was a personal mission. And today, like every other day, he was on patrol, keeping an eye out for anything or anyone that didn't belong. Up ahead, he spotted her. A black woman, mid-40s, with a confident stride and an athletic build. She was jogging at a steady pace, earbuds in, lost in her own world. Her running shoes were sleek, her gear expensive, and she looked like she belonged. But something about her unsettled Calloway. Maybe it was the way she didn't glance in his direction as his cruiser passed. Most people at least acknowledged a police car, but she didn't. Or maybe it was the silver Tesla she jogged past, parked in a driveway. Did she come from there? Was she casing houses? Or maybe it was nothing at all. Calloway pulled over, the tires crunching against the pavement as he stepped out. He adjusted his duty belt, making sure his presence was noticed. His eyes locked on her as she slowed down, yanking out one earbud. She was breathing hard but controlled, wiping a bit of sweat from her forehead. She barely looked fazed by his presence. "Something wrong, officer?" she asked, still catching her breath. Calloway's voice was steady, edged with the quiet authority he'd mastered over the years. "Where you coming from?" She blinked, glancing up the street before answering. "Home. Just getting in my run." "Where's home?" She tilted her head slightly, something shifting in her expression. "Couple blocks down." "Why?" Calloway's jaw tightened. "Got ID on you?" There it was, the moment the situation shifted. Her face hardened just a fraction, the casual ease in her posture tightening. "For what?" Calloway lifted his chin slightly, studying her. He didn't like being questioned. "Just need to make sure everything checks out." She exhaled sharply, hands on her hips. "You pulled over to stop a woman jogging in broad daylight because you think I'm a threat?" He didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. She huffed a short laugh, reaching for her phone. "You know what? Let's just call someone who actually enforces the law correctly." Calloway stepped forward, not aggressively, not violently, but deliberately. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Show me some identification." Her fingers tightened around her phone, and Calloway noticed. In his mind, the situation had officially escalated. But he didn't realize he was making the biggest mistake of his career. The street was still, the only sounds the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint murmur of distant traffic. But for Simone Daniels, the world had narrowed down to the man in front of her, the officer standing too close, the weight of his stare pressing down like an unseen force. She knew this routine, knew the pattern, knew what happened when someone like her challenged someone like him. But she also knew her rights. "I'm not required to carry ID while jogging," she said evenly. Calloway shifted, adjusting his stance. "That's so." Her voice was calm, unwavering, but Calloway saw it differently. To him, it was defiance. He glanced around. The street was mostly empty, just a few houses with drawn blinds, one or two people in their yards subtly watching. No one stepping in. "I'm investigating suspicious activity," he said, his voice clipped. "What activity?" Calloway paused. He didn't expect to be challenged like this. "You were running past a home that had a high-value vehicle in the driveway," he said, as if that justified everything. Simone laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You mean the Tesla? So now jogging past a parked car is a crime?" Calloway's jaw tightened. "You're refusing to identify yourself. I'm refusing to be harassed." That word, harassed, burned in Calloway's chest. His authority was being called into question, in broad daylight, in front of strangers. He took a step closer. "You're resisting my investigation." Simone's expression hardened. "I'm resisting nothing. You're abusing your badge, and you know it." Her hand twitched near her phone again, and Calloway didn't think, he reacted. He grabbed her wrist. It happened fast, the shift from words to action. One moment she was standing her ground. The next, he was pulling her arm behind her back, metal cuffs flashing in the sun. "What the hell?" she shouted, struggling against his grip. "You're under arrest for obstruction," Calloway said automatically. Like he was reading from a script. People stopped and stared. A man on his porch pulled out his phone, recording. A woman across the street watched, frozen in place. "You're making a mistake," Simone gritted out, fighting to keep her voice controlled. Calloway tightened the cuffs, ignoring the eyes on him. "You should have cooperated." Simone exhaled sharply through her nose, her pulse pounding in her ears. But her voice was steady when she spoke. "You don't even know who I am." Calloway didn't care. But he should have, because his world was about to come crashing down. The steel of the handcuffs dug into Simone's wrist as Calloway tightened his grip, pressing her arms behind her back. Her chest rose and fell, controlled but tense. She had been here before, not in these exact cuffs, not in this exact moment, but she knew this feeling. The weight of power being abused. Calloway didn't see the problem. To him, this was just another day on the job. Another suspect neutralized. Another moment where he got to walk away feeling like he was in control, but the world around him was shifting. A small crowd had begun to form. A man across the street kept recording, his phone steady, capturing every second. A woman standing near her mailbox called out. She wasn't doing anything. Calloway ignored them. He pressed his radio, "Dispatch. I have a 10 to 15. Female suspect refusing to identify herself. Sending for transport." Simone laughed under her breath. "You really think this is going to go your way, huh?" Calloway didn't respond. He didn't need to. The law was on his side, or at least that's what he'd always believed. Another voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, officer. What's going on here?" A man in his 50s, well-dressed, with an air of authority that didn't match the rest of the bystanders, stepped forward. His suit jacket was slung over one shoulder, and his eyes flicked from Simone to Calloway. Calloway didn't flinch. "Sir, please stand back." The man didn't move. Instead, he looked at Simone, then at the cuffs, then back at Calloway. "I asked what's going on." "She was being uncooperative," Calloway said, his voice firm but slipping just slightly. The man tilted his head. "Uncooperative." Simone exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "He stopped me while I was jogging, asked for ID. I told him I didn't need to carry one. Now here we are." The man's expression darkened. "Is that so?" Calloway could feel the shift. The weight in the air was different now. He noticed the way people were watching, the way the man standing in front of him wasn't afraid. A black SUV pulled up, tinted windows, unmarked plates, the kind of vehicle Calloway knew belonged to someone with pull. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Captain Ronald Briggs, Calloway's commanding officer. And he looked pissed. The crowd parted just slightly as Briggs strode toward them, his eyes locked on Calloway. The tension was thick. Calloway straightened, trying to maintain his stance of control, but something felt off. Briggs stopped a few feet away, glancing between Calloway and Simone, who was still in cuffs. His jaw tightened, and then he said two words that hit Calloway like a sledgehammer. "Uncuff her." Calloway blinked. "Sir." Briggs stepped forward. "I said uncuff her." "Now." Calloway hesitated. This didn't make sense. His boss was ordering him to release a suspect? Briggs turned to Simone. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Are you hurt?" Simone shook her head slowly. "I'm fine." Calloway's stomach sank. Briggs exhaled through his nose before turning back to Calloway. "Do you even know who you just put in handcuffs?" The street was silent. Calloway swallowed, his grip on the cuffs loosening just slightly. "Sir." She refused to identify herself. Briggs stepped forward, his voice dropping. "That's because she doesn't have to." Calloway's heart pounded. The SUV, the way everyone was staring, the way Briggs wasn't just mad, he was furious. Simone watched him carefully, her voice calm and controlled. "My name is Chief Simone Daniels." Calloway stopped breathing. She let it sit, let him process, and then she added, her voice sharp as steel, "And you just arrested your boss." The weight of those words hit like a truck. Calloway's mouth went dry. He felt the eyes of every single person in that crowd, the cameras recording, the neighbors whispering. The moment caved in on him, but this wasn't over. Not yet. Briggs stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the silence. "I said uncuff her." "Now." Calloway didn't hesitate this time. His hands fumbled slightly as he released the cuffs, stepping back as Simone rubbed her wrists. The red marks left behind made his stomach turn. The crowd was silent, but the tension was electric. The phones were still recording. The man in the suit was watching with a look that made Calloway's skin prickle with something close to shame. Simone took a deep breath, composed but with a sharpness in her eyes that Calloway didn't miss. She rolled her shoulders before turning to face him directly. "You think your badge gives you the right to stop whoever you want?" Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through the air like a blade. You think jogging while black is a crime? Calloway opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing, no justification, no excuse that wouldn't sound weak. Simone tilted her head, watching him carefully. I watched you make a decision today. I watched you decide I didn't belong here. You didn't know who I was, and that was all you needed to see me as a suspect. Calloway shifted his weight, his face hot, but he couldn't break eye contact. Simone stepped closer, her voice lower now, just for him. You put your hands on me. You humiliated me. You were ready to throw me in the back of a squad car over nothing. And if I were anyone else, if I weren't in this uniform, you know exactly how this could have ended. Calloway swallowed. His hands twitched at his sides. She leaned in slightly. How many others have you done this to? That question hit him harder than anything else. Because the answer wasn't zero. Briggs stepped in, his voice firm. Sergeant Calloway, you're relieved of duty until further notice. Hand over your badge and gun. The words stung. Calloway's fingers hovered over his belt, his pride warring with the reality in front of him. The moment stretched too long, too thick with unspoken weight. And then, slowly, he unclipped his badge. He placed it in Briggs' waiting palm, then his sidearm. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced his face to stay neutral. Simone watched him for a long moment. The video of Sergeant Calloway arresting Chief Simone Daniels didn't just go viral, it ignited a firestorm. By morning, #JoggingWhileBlack was trending nationwide. News vans lined the streets of Brookfield, and protesters gathered outside the police station, their chants echoing through the once quiet neighborhood. The incident wasn't just a mistake, it was a spark that exposed years of simmering tension. Inside the station, Captain Ronald Briggs sat in his office, his face buried in his hands. The stack of complaints on his desk was growing by the hour. Calls from the mayor, the media, and even the governor demanded answers. But the most damning evidence came from within the department itself. Officers and civilians alike were coming forward with stories about Calloway, times when his instincts had led to questionable arrests, especially in minority neighborhoods. Briggs picked up the phone and dialed internal affairs. We need a full investigation. And I mean full. Pull every file, every report, every complaint tied to Calloway. This isn't just about one arrest, it's about a pattern. Meanwhile, Calloway sat in his living room, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His wife, Laura, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing. How could you do this, Brian? How could you be so blind? Calloway didn't answer. He couldn't. The image of Simone Daniels, calm, composed, and utterly in control, haunted him. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his instincts were infallible. But now? Now he wasn't so sure. His teenage daughter, Emily, walked in, her eyes red from crying. Dad, everyone at school is talking about it. They're saying you're racist. Her voice broke on the last word, and Calloway flinched. I'm not, he started, but Laura cut him off. Then what are you, Brian? Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you targeted that woman because of the color of her skin. Calloway opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down, he knew she was right. He had seen Simone as a threat because she was black, because she didn't fit his idea of who belonged in that neighborhood. And now his family was paying the price. At the police station, Simone Daniels sat in her office, reviewing the latest reports. The media frenzy was exhausting, but she knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been stopped, questioned, or arrested for no reason other than the color of their skin. She had a responsibility to make sure this moment led to real change. Her phone buzzed. It was Briggs. Chief, we've started the investigation. But it's not looking good for Calloway. There's a pattern here. A lot of complaints. Simone leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. I'm not surprised. This isn't just about one bad cop, Ron. It's about a system that lets this kind of thing happen over and over again. Briggs sighed. I know. But where do we even start? We start by holding him accountable, Simone said firmly. And then we look at the bigger picture. Training, policies, community outreach. This is a chance to make real changes. But first, we need to show the community that we're serious about fixing this. As the investigation unfolded, Calloway found himself increasingly isolated. His fellow officers avoided him, and the few who did speak to him offered only awkward condolences. Tough break, man, one said, clapping him on the shoulder before quickly walking away. Calloway tried to focus on the facts. He hadn't broken any laws, right? He had followed procedure. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how flimsy his justification was. Suspicious activity? Jogging past a Tesla? It sounded ridiculous even to him. One evening, as he sat alone in his living room, the doorbell rang. It was his old partner, Mike, a man he hadn't seen in years. Mike looked older, grayer, but his eyes were the same, sharp and knowing. "Hey, Brian," Mike said, stepping inside. "Heard about what happened. Thought I'd check in." Calloway nodded, grateful for the company. They sat in silence for a while before Mike spoke again. "You know, back when we were partners, I always thought you were a good cop. Tough, yeah, but fair. But this is different." Calloway looked down at his hands. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong." Mike sighed. "That's the problem, Brian. You didn't think. You just acted. And now you're paying the price." The investigation reached its climax a week later. Calloway was called into the station for a formal hearing. The room was packed, internal affairs, department brass, even a few reporters. Simone Daniels sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. The evidence was damning. Complaints from over a dozen people, all with similar stories. Calloway had stopped them, questioned them, and in some cases, arrested them for no reason other than their race. The room was silent as the last report was read aloud. Finally, Simone spoke. "Sergeant Calloway, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Calloway looked around the room, his heart pounding. For the first time in his career, he felt truly exposed. I thought I was doing my job," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was keeping people safe." Simone leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "And how many people did you hurt in the process?" Calloway didn't answer. He couldn't. Simone stood, her voice firm. "Effective immediately, Sergeant Calloway. You are suspended without pay pending further review. This isn't just about you. It's about rebuilding trust with the community. And that starts with accountability." As Calloway left the room, the weight of his actions settled over him like a storm cloud. He had always believed he was the hero of his own story. But now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The suspension hit Calloway harder than he expected. Without his badge and gun, he felt like a stranger in his own life. The house was too quiet, the days too long. Laura and Emily tiptoed around him, their conversations strained and awkward. The weight of his actions, and the public backlash, was suffocating. One morning, as he sat at the kitchen table scrolling through news articles about the incident, a knock at the door startled him. It was Mike, his old partner, holding a folder thick with papers. "Thought you might want to see this," Mike said, handing him the folder. "It's the full internal affairs report. They're not holding back, Brian." Calloway flipped through the pages, his stomach churning. The report detailed years of complaints. Black and Latino residents stopped for suspicious activity, teenagers harassed for loitering, and countless others who had been humiliated or worse. And at the center of it all was his name. This can't be right," Calloway muttered, his voice shaking. I wasn't. You were," Mike interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You just didn't see it. But now you have to. For your sake, and for theirs." Calloway closed the folder, his hands trembling. "What am I supposed to do, Mike? Apologize? Say I'm sorry and hope it all goes away?" Mike shook his head. "It's not about making it go away. It's about making it right. And that starts with owning up to what you've done." At the police station, Simone Daniels was busy implementing changes. She had called a town hall meeting to address the community's concerns, and the turnout was overwhelming. The room was packed with residents, activists, and reporters, all eager to hear what she had to say. Simone stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding the room. "I want to start by saying this. What happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem, a problem that has been ignored for far too long." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger and frustration palpable. "But today," Simone continued, "we have an opportunity to change that. We're launching a full review of our policies and procedures, with a focus on accountability and transparency. We're also partnering with community organizations to improve trust and communication. This is just the beginning, but it's a step in the right direction." As she spoke, Calloway stood at the back of the room, unnoticed. He had come to listen, to understand, but the weight of the crowd's anger was overwhelming. He slipped out before the meeting ended, his mind racing. The next day, Calloway received a summons to appear before the city council. The hearing was public, and the room was packed with reporters and community members. Simone and Briggs sat at the front, their expressions unreadable, The council chairwoman, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, called the meeting to order. Sergeant Calloway, you're here today to answer for your actions. Do you have anything to say? Calloway stood, his legs unsteady. He looked out at the sea of faces, angry, curious, hopeful, and took a deep breath. I made a mistake, he began, his voice shaky. A big one. And I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to Chief Daniels, but for everyone I've hurt over the years. I thought I was doing my job, but I was wrong. And I'm ready to face the consequences. The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. What are you going to do to make it right? Calloway hesitated, then straightened. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll go through training, work with the community, whatever you need. I can't change the past, but I can try to make the future better. Simone stood, her expression thoughtful. Accountability isn't just about punishment, she said. It's about growth. If you're serious about making amends, then prove it. Show us you've changed. In the weeks that followed, Calloway threw himself into the work. He attended bias training, met with community leaders, and even joined a restorative justice program. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when he wanted to give up, but he kept going. One afternoon, he found himself at a community center, helping to organize a youth outreach program. As he worked, a young black teenager approached him, his expression wary. You're that cop, right? The one who arrested Chief Daniels. Calloway nodded, bracing himself for the anger he expected. But the teenager surprised him. My mom says you're trying to do better. Is that true? Calloway looked at the boy, his heart heavy. I'm trying, he said honestly. But it's not enough to just try. I have to prove it. Every day. The teenager studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because we're watching. As the months passed, the changes began to take root. The department implemented new policies, including mandatory bias training and stricter oversight of officer conduct. Community relations improved, and the protests slowly faded. But for Calloway, the work was far from over. He knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to make amends. And as he stood in front of a new class of recruits, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned, he realized that this was his chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for the community he had sworn to protect. That a year had passed since the incident that changed everything. The streets of Brookfield were quieter now, but not in the way they used to be. The silence wasn't born of ignorance or complacency. It was the calm of a community healing, of a system slowly being rebuilt from the ground up. Sergeant Brian Calloway stood in front of a small crowd at the community center, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. The room was filled with faces he recognized, residents he'd once patrolled, colleagues he'd once worked alongside, and people he'd hurt. Among them was Chief Simone Daniels, sitting in the front row, her expression unreadable. This wasn't a hearing or a trial. It was a town hall meeting, one of many that had become a regular occurrence since the reforms began. Calloway had been invited to speak, not as an officer, but as someone who had lived through the consequences of his actions and was trying to make amends. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak today, Calloway began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. A year ago, I stood before you as someone who had caused harm. Today, I stand here as someone who's trying to do better. The room was silent, every eye fixed on him. Calloway took a deep breath and continued. I've spent the past year learning about bias, about accountability, about the impact of my actions on this community. I've listened to your stories, and I've heard your pain. And I want you to know that I'm committed to being part of the solution, not the problem. He paused, glancing at Simone. She gave him a small nod, her expression softening just slightly. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. After the meeting, Calloway found himself outside, the cool evening air a welcome relief. He was about to leave when a voice stopped him. Brian. He turned to see Simone approaching, her hands in her coat pockets. You did good in there, she said. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Calloway nodded. I know, and I'm ready to keep going. Whatever it takes. Simone studied him for a moment, then sighed. You know, when this all started, I wasn't sure you'd ever get it. But you've surprised me. Don't stop now. Calloway smiled faintly. I won't. I promise. As the months turned into years, the changes in Brookfield became undeniable. The police department, once a source of fear and mistrust, was now a model for community policing. Officers attended regular bias training, body cameras were mandatory, and a civilian oversight board ensured accountability. Calloway, no longer a sergeant, had found a new role as a community liaison. He worked with local organizations to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community, sharing his story as a cautionary tale and a lesson in growth. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still people who didn't trust him, but he kept going. One evening, as he walked through the neighborhood he once patrolled, he saw a familiar face. It was the young black teenager he'd met at the community center a year ago. The boy was older now, his wary expression replaced with a cautious smile. "Hey," the boy said. "You're still here, huh?" Calloway nodded. "Yeah, still trying." The boy shrugged. "Good. We're still watching." Calloway chuckled. "I wouldn't expect anything less." The story of Sergeant Brian Calloway and Chief Simone Daniels became a turning point, not just for Brookfield, but for communities everywhere. It was a reminder that change is possible, but only if we're willing to confront our mistakes and do the hard work of making things right. As the sun set over the quiet streets of Brookfield, Calloway stood at the edge of the park, watching a group of kids play basketball. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He knew he could never undo the harm he'd caused, but he could keep moving forward, one step at a time, and that, he realized, was enough.